Quickie precursor. I had trouble making this video, and it's not because of feelings or anything like that, but because when I turned on the camera and began to attempt to tell my story, I realized that this event isn't really storytime compatible. There was a beginning, there was a middle, and then there was an end, which was drawn out over a 4-year slow death, and it can mostly be summarized in a tweet. How do you articulate something so uneventful and bland? How do you describe the flavor of unseasoned potato salad? You can't, because it feels weird and annoying inside your mouth, and it doesn't taste like anything. I really struggled through this, and with take after take, and this thing is loaded with material for a solid gag reel for days. So if you need clarification on anything I've said in this video, please leave it in the comments, because in hindsight, I know if I scripted this thing, I would have made a ton more sense. But, you know, lesson learned. So you remember that time in New York where a bunch of ravers just started infiltrating the goth clubs and then completely destroyed the scene? Yeah, me too. That actually happened. And I know it sounds really harsh, but the way that Cybergoth happened in New York was very abrupt, and I don't think it was the same that it happened in other places. The way that it happened here was all of a sudden we started noticing ravers in the clubs. And they were, I say ravers, but they were more like people you'd find at house clubs. We had a club here called The Tunnel, and there were a bunch of other nights, but they started spilling over for some reason into the goth nights. I guess they just got bored, and they started taking over. And I remember the first night I noticed it, it was so abrupt. It was like last Saturday, it was the goth scene as I knew it. The Saturday after, it was gone. And had I known from that first moment that I looked over the balcony at the back cave, down onto the floor where you'd normally find the bands playing. And on nights that bands weren't playing, they would spin your variety of industrial EBM music, that kind of thing. I looked over the balcony, and I saw girls in little skimpy, like, house music kind of go-go dancing outfits, like all neon, dancing up on the stage. And had I known that that moment was going to be prolific in the sense it was going to mark the beginning of the end of the goth scene, I would have cherished every moment up until that point a hell of a lot more. I would have taken a lot more pictures. I wish I still had the photographs, but, you know, over the years, I guess as teenagers do, they steal your photos. Well, that's what happened to me. And I would have protected the photos that I had a lot more and taken more in the interim. But that moment, that really was like the beginning of the end. And it wasn't abnormal to me to see these girls go-go dancing in their little like fishnet neon outfits, and they were strung out. And that's something that I know it's a little bit judgmental, but you ever look at people and they're on drugs and you could tell because they're like falling all over themselves and their eyes are rolling in the back of their head? That. And I guess growing up in a house where you have 2 drug addicted parents who also hung out with other people that were addicted to drugs, you kind of develop a little bit of a sixth sense for being able to spot people that are on drugs. So, plus they were a little bit obvious about it. But it wasn't abnormal for me to see, because the way the goth clubs were, you would always find your random people kind of coming in and going out. It was kind of like the tides, the way they rolled in and rolled out. You'd have people come in because they would walk by the club and they'd see the patrons going in and out and like, whoa, what is this place? Let's go in and check it out. They would come in, and they would make a night of it, they would hang out, and sometimes that would be the last time you saw them, and other times you'd make a regular out of them, which was kind of cool. But that's why seeing them go-go dancing on the stage to the music was not, wasn't abnormal to me, because it was just, like I said, we'd see people in and out all the time. But what I didn't know is that as each week would progress, not only would they still be there, but they would bring in more. And something that I also didn't expect was I didn't expect the goths who had supported the scene all these years get put on the back burner and suddenly watch our music that we came to listen to diminished. We also listened to industrial music too, because our nights were always combined, as I told you. You know, you'd go there, you'd hear your goth, your new wave, your dark wave, your synth pop, your industrial. These are all the things that you'd go and you'd hear. But suddenly the music is now catering more and more toward them. we're hearing more EBM music, we're hearing more electronic music, and we're hearing a lot less goth, to the point where I think you'd hear maybe 2 or 3 goth songs going into the Batcave. And you're going into a place called the Batcave. Can you imagine going the whole night and only hearing like 2 or 3 goth songs? It's a fucking travesty. So this is how it began here. It wasn't so much a deviation or the introduction to something new, so much as an infestation. And I know that sounds so rough, but it really was. It was the ravers or the house. I don't know, what would you call somebody that listens to house music? The housers? I have no friggin' idea. I called them ass ravers because I hated them. But suddenly you're going into your goth nights and you're seeing people with glow sticks. Am I in the fucking Twilight Zone here? Like, what is happening? I lived in England for about 6 years. And I went there around 2005, 2006. And 2005 is when the scene tanked here. And there I saw a lot of people who are in the Cybergoth scene. And I call it a scene because I do see it as something very different from the goth scene itself. So, sorry, I'm very thirsty. So, there it was very different, even fashionably, because in New York, you had people whose clothing was in no way version or even like an evolution. It had no remnants of any sort of goth style in it. It was just neon and bright and day glow and UV reactive. And it wasn't even close to the Cybergoth that you would know today, because they weren't Cybergoths, if that makes sense. Where in the UK, it was more like, it was more futuristic. It was more, it reminded me, honestly, they were more like Cenobites and very Giger-esque. You know, I think the way that it happened in the UK was the way it didn't happen in New York. And I know a lot of people were very, very upset about the way that it happened here. Because, like I said, we were put on the back burner. And we were sort of pushed aside while they allowed them to take over. Now, I adapted my style a bit, and as did a lot of the other regulars, because we saw a little bit of new things coming in. And the way that we did it was more in the UK sense, where it was still very dark, very Cenobite, very Giger. And I loved, for example, Dane. As the shift started taking place musically, a lot of the patrons started adapting. We kind of accepted things for the way that they were, and it didn't really hit right away. A lot of different synth pop music, and it was the bands that I told you about, that they would come to the States to play, and they would see the audience and be utterly flabbergasted, where they're like, who the hell are these people? They had no idea that the audience that they were popular amongst is pretty much alternative, when back home in Europe, they're popular amongst a mainstream crowd. But that was what we had to cling to. And it wasn't just in New York, because at the time, my boyfriend was in a synth pop band, and we would travel around a lot, and he would play in different clubs. So I had gone to a lot of different clubs in New Jersey. I went to clubs in Boston, went to clubs in Philly. It was Evolution in Philadelphia. It was QXT's in New Jersey, and I cannot remember the life of me the night that they played in, where was it, in Boston. But I remember they played with a band called Battery Cage. But neither of those places played not a single goth band at all. So it was around this time that it was almost like goth became extinct. It was really hard to find a place to listen to the music, and any place that really popped up that played it, they would close almost immediately because nobody was really going. For some reason, electronic music was really reigning supreme, and a lot of the people were allowing it to happen. And it was just really weird to see. It was almost like nobody had any fight in them left. They just kind of allowed it to happen, and there's just tons and tons of like EBM and synth pop. And I remember in the beginning I was seeing a lot of goth bands. I had seen Clan of Zymox, Diary of Dreams, Alien Sex Fiend, Switchblade Symphony, and suddenly it's changing, and I'm seeing a lot more. It's like a ton of electronic bands now, and that's all that really seems to be coming around. This is really hard for me to talk about because it was something that was really abrupt, and it's also something that's really difficult to kind of put into words, because as it's happening, like I said, it happened very abruptly, and then the death was something that happened gradually, because it was something that we didn't realize was slowly taking place. Now, like I said, we were really put on the back burner, but a lot of the patrons just sort of accepted things for the way that they were. And as the goth music became less and less, and it got to where there was basically none played aside from like your basic staples like Lucretia, My Reflection, that kind of thing, we started clinging to a lot of synth pop music because that's what we were being fed, and that was the closest thing that we could get to our beloved goth music. You know, we're listening to Division, Kai the Vez, we're listening to Be Born Baton, and you know, as well as new wave. And it really did suck because we were being pushed out, and we didn't realize it at the time, but we were being pushed out as electronic music was essentially taking over. And rather than do what we always did, and that was have that separation, you'd have your industrial music, you have your goth music, and that was the way that we kept our nights. They allowed the people that were into the house music, they allowed them to take over. They allowed everything. They allowed the electronic music to just take over. And I like electronic music, don't get me wrong. I really do like a lot of electronic music, but not all at once. And you don't allow it to come in and take over a friggin' scene. And now, industrial music is pretty much dead. Industrial music, the way I know it, the way that we grew up with it, is nothing compared to what it is now. You couldn't put them side by side and say that they're the same genre. Industrial music back then was so cohesive with goth music. It was the reason that our nights got along so well. It was the reason that we could coexist the way that we did. It's because they matched. They were dark. They were brooding. They had the same spirit. They were entirely different genres of music, but they were close enough to where we could listen to both and we can sustain a night. I'm fortunate in the sense that, and I really say this in a sense that I have a lot of gratitude. I don't say it in a sense that, you know, I want to rub it in anybody's face, because I really do feel so much gratitude for the fact that I was able to come into the scene when I did and see it in its heyday. And you'll hear a lot of people say that the 80s were the heyday, and these are people who weren't even born until the 1990s. So when they say that, just take it with a grain of salt. You can't go into something and change it. If you're going to go into a goth night, go in there because you're interested. Go in because you like it. You want to know what it's all about. But you don't go in and just try to change it into something completely different. And that was what was allowed to happen. What scared me was that when I left New York in 2005, like I said, that was when the scene pretty much crashed. I went to the UK and I lived there for a few years, and I came back. And when I came back to visit, everything was gone. Everything. It was like an apocalypse had happened in the scene. All the clubs, every single club that I knew and loved, everything, it was gone. All the goth stores that I knew, gone. There was nothing. There was virtually nothing. There was no representation in the scene, and any semblance of a scene was moved completely online. I hope that my story is making sense to you, because it's becoming exponentially harder as I go on to articulate this. Imagine trying to tell someone a story about a really boring party that sucked and you hated. You're not going to remember everything, and it's going to be a really difficult story to tell because you're trying to recount things that were dumb. This is going to be the hardest video for me to edit because it's the hardest video for me to tell. I don't know if you notice I'm like stammering and I'm kind of like trying to find the words, but it's how do you tell a story about the most dull and boring time that you've ever had when there's nothing to kind of grasp onto? It's like somebody going rock climbing, but there's no like divots for them to grab. It's like somebody asks you, hey, how was it? It sucked. Why? Because it did. Because it was boring. Because nothing happened. There's no... It's uneventful. We have nothing to really talk about other than the fact that we let electronic music take over, and that's, shouldn't have happened, but it happened. So to summarize, what were the early to mid-2000s like? Well, the house clubs started spilling over into the goth nights, and they began to take over, push goth out, and as goth began to slowly diminish, electronic music took over. Many people adapted to it, other people did not, and in a few years, the goth scene eventually met its cruel demise. But fast forward to now, goth is more than on the upswing. It's pretty much back. We have more bands coming out now than we ever have. Amazing music. There are shows. There are more clubs than I can count on two hands, just in the state of New York. And there are people who are contributing and they're doing things that are positive within the scene. It is thriving, and thankfully we have learned from our mistakes. So now the Cybergoth scene is something entirely different. It's completely separate from the goth scene itself. I know a lot of people will disagree with me and say, oh, it has everything to do with goth. No, it doesn't. It has its own scene. It's evolved and kind of moved over and done its thing as it should, and it's entirely separate from the Ravers that came and took over many moons ago. So that is my story. That is how I remember it. This will be a cluster of a patchwork quilt to put together, and let's see how the story pans out. For future reference, anybody who gets the silicone straws, probably not best to wash them in the dishwasher, because they taste salty. Probably not good.